Hey there, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to talk about buying used General Motors 6L80s and 90s for purposes of either overhaul or to install as is to replace one that went bad. So much like my other buying used transmission videos, this one's going to touch on all the different inspection procedures that I perform to assess the condition of the unit and try to get a bead on whether or not it'll work for me from a rebuilder's perspective. But I will also discuss considerations for those that are looking for one of these transmissions to install and run it just as it is. So a lot of the information that we'll cover will pertain and apply to pretty much any transmission out there, at least any automatic transmission, even to some extent manuals. But there's also going to be some information that I share that is specific to this particular family of transmissions. So most of it will also apply to the 6L45 and 6L50. Those are the lighter duty versions of these transmissions. There's 4 of them in total in the GM family of 6 speeds, the 6L45, 50, 80, and 90. The 80 and 90 are going to be your medium and heavy duty transmissions respectively, whereas the other 2 are light duty, small displacement engine type units. Alright, so first things first, as always, you want to make sure you have a few things with you before you go shopping for transmissions. And if possible, have all of these things. So first thing you're going to want to bring is obviously a pair of gloves and perhaps a rag. Both will help you kind of spin shafts and investigate the unit without getting your hands dirty and then it'll grimy, because chances are whatever transmission you're going to be looking at, it's going to look kind of like this or maybe worse, you know, with mud or oil or, you know, just grit and dirt all over it. Second thing you're going to want is a good flashlight. So I have this snap-on flashlight on the bench. You've also seen me use my Surefire stiletto, which is actually what I'd recommend over that one, but any flashlight will do as long as it's got a decent beam and you can see into the pan from where the dipstick tube port is. Alright, now if you have one, bring a 32 spline slip yoke, because that will allow you to spin the output shaft a lot easier than trying to do it by hand, especially if you're looking for a 4x4 unit. And, you know, with the shorter shaft, you're not going to have anywhere near as much leverage to spin it, especially in the counterclockwise direction against engine rotation. And that's a key part of, you know, performing this kind of inspection or evaluation of any of these transmissions. All right, and then lastly, a good set of gloves. So I have these gloves. These are, the hell brand these are, Hardy. They're from Harbor Freight, and I think they're like $5 for a pair. I have like several of them. So and if you've watched any of my other teardown inspection videos, you've seen me wear them. Alright, so the 6Ls went into production in 2006, the 6L80 into Corvettes and some Cadillacs, and then starting in 2007 they began to install that transmission into, you know, many of the truck submodels like the Tahoes and Denali's and things like that. The 6L90s began production in 2007, and they are the heavy-duty equivalent, more or less analogous to the 4L80E, but for the 6-speed family, and they went into the you know, higher-end or heavier-duty truck and SUV chassis. So let's go ahead and get a little bit closer, get the camera angle changed up, and then I'm going to start with an exterior examination, point out things you want to look at. A lot of this is going to be common sense, but I'll just walk through it so we can be kind of exhaustive, and then we'll get into some specific procedures that are going to be organic to these transmissions and things you need to know, especially if you are looking to buy one of these to swap in place of one that has gone bad. I mean, there's some critical things that apply to these 6 speeds that aren't anything that you need to really worry about when it comes to 4L60s and 4L80s. Okay, the very first thing you're going to do when looking at a transmission, any transmission, doesn't matter what it is just eyeball the case thoroughly. You're looking at the case, you're looking at the extension housing. Now this particular trans is a 6L90 out of a 2013 Cadillac CTS-V, so it has a output shaft that's flanged, and that is more or less organic, I believe, to the CTS or CTS-Vs that took this family of transmissions. So if you have either an output shaft that looks like this, or a 3-yeared or 4-yeared flanged output shaft, it's going to be a lot easier to spin versus, you know, just the splines. So you know, just be aware of that. All right, now you can spin it. Okay, when you spin the shaft, you're gonna, I'm spinning it clockwise in the direction engine rotation. I mean, it's counterclockwise from your point of view, but clockwise from the point of view of the engine. It should spin nice and free. Okay, hear that? There's, well, I guess maybe you can't really hear it, but there's no hint of grinding, galling, no unusual sounds coming from the case. Okay, now when you spin it counterclockwise, it's going to be significantly more difficult and require a lot more effort. Okay, all right, now that's just spinning the output shaft by itself. So what I like to do is I like to hold one shaft, while I spin the others. So here I'm going to hold the input shaft and spin the output shaft. And what I'm looking for here is any indication that the input shaft is somehow bound or mated, force mated to the output shaft by way of damage inside the case. Because the only way that you're going to have a situation where the input shaft and output shaft are spinning in a 1-to-1 ratio, where one is being forced to spin when you're spinning the other, is if there's significant damage inside the case. So if you're spinning the input shaft, and that's what I'm doing now, you're going to notice the output shaft spin a little bit. And that's because that this thing's laden with fluid and frictions are adhering to steels, and that's considered normal. But when you put your hand on the output shaft, either with a slip yoke or like this with the flange, and you spin the input shaft, it should not want to, the output shaft should not want to force its, your hand to turn with it. Okay, you should be able to spin these two in the opposite direction without any real problem at all. All right, so one of the more common things I see with transmissions in general is damage to the bell housing, and that's almost always due to the transmission being dropped when it, at some point in the past, when there was attempts to remove it from the vehicle, usually by people that don't have the right equipment, or they don't know what they're doing, or they're just simply not being careful, and they drop the transmission and it'll land on the bell and crack the bell. Okay, you also want to check the rest of the case for this. So again, your preliminary examination of the case visually should be looking for any kinds of cracks or fissures, any indication that this thing was dropped or otherwise got damaged at some point in the past. Okay. All right, over here you're going to find your date code information. I will flash a visual on the screen and a close-up view of this so that you can kind of decode this yourself. But basically what this will tell you is the year of production, and then the next three characters are all going to be alpha. That will tell you the application, so you can look that up, or you can contact GM. And then there's other information on here, including the GM part number for this entire assembly. Okay, most GM part numbers, at least for transmission parts, are going to start with the 242. So that's a good indication that if you're not sure what you're looking at, if it's 242, then it's associated with a transmission. All right, check fasteners. Okay, these get put on with 37 foot-pounds of torque, and they're usually hard and fast. In other words, they should not be loose under any circumstances. So just double check that. If you see loose fasteners, then you might inquire as to whether or not something like the extension housing might have been off, or what had occurred with the transmission. Now, we're going to make several assumptions here, one of which is the whoever you're buying this from, whoever's selling it doesn't know anything about it, or if they do, they're trying to conceal information from you because they want to make their problem your problem. Okay, I should have said that at the outset, but that's kind of the premise and the mindset you want to go into one of these ventures when you're looking for used transmissions. So you may be on Facebook Marketplace, Craigslist, local internet forums, enthusiast forums that where people buy and sell in like a buy sell trade subforum or whatever. And I mean, most people, especially on the forums, are honest. I mean, that's been my experience. But you're eventually going to run into somebody that's not. So you want to always have a defensive posture, and that's kind of why I produce these videos, so that you have the information that you need to be able to spot things like someone being purposely deceptive and trying to sell you something that is no good. All right, so always look for loose fasteners. Fasteners that should not be loose are things like the extension housing, and especially the front pump bolts. You know, just kind of feel them. All right, if they're loose or if there's signs that this thing's been worked on, you definitely want to make an inquiry as to what was done and, you know, why these bolts are loose. Okay. All right, check the little dipstick plug. All right, a lot of these transmissions unfortunately don't have traditional dipsticks, so you have a plug here. In the event that's the case, like I said, it may be that your whoever you're buying this from is not going to let you manipulate anything. I mean, that's the other assumption we want to make. But see if we can get this one out. All right, so you'll probably want a screwdriver or pry bar. The reason why I didn't have this out on the bench initially is because I don't just necessarily want to assume someone's going to let you do what I just did, but I think most people are comfortable with doing so. I don't think that would be a problem, but you never know. All right. The other area you want to look at in these transmissions especially is the case connector on the back of the case. All right, so that's going to be right there. Let me zoom in so you can get a better view of it. Okay, so this is going to be very critical. You want to make sure that none of these pins are damaged. All right, unlike a 4L60E or 4L80E where they just have a standalone wiring harness that's, you know, usually less than 75 bucks to replace, these pins on that connector are all part of the TECM, or Transmission Electronic Hydraulic Control Module, for these units. So if any one of those pins are damaged, you do not want to buy this transmission, especially if you intend to run it as is, because your transmission will never work. Okay. To replace these TECMs is very, very expensive compared to a 4-speed, because there you're only replacing the wiring harness. Here you're replacing the entire transmission control module, and that's going to run you anywhere from $550, $600 from an aftermarket remanufacturer of these to upwards of over $1,000 if you're buying OEM. So make sure that those pins are all intact and they look like the pins you see here on this one. Okay, this part here, this is just the pass-through sleeve. Okay, pass-through sleeve I think costs like 20 bucks. You know, it's not really a part of the case connector. It literally just functions as a means to facilitate the external connectors mating to the TECM connector that you see here. So always check that, make sure that those pins are not damaged and that nothing looks awry in this area. All right, continuing on. Checking here, or this area right here. What this is going to be your parking rod assemblies pole housing. So you're going to have a parking rod actuator, and then you're going to have a parking pole. This is the housing for that. And so if this is leaking right here, okay, if you see evidence that this is leaking, then you're going to need a specialized tool to yank this roll pin out that secures the housing into the case. And that tool is somewhat hard to find. It's basically a roll pin puller slide hammer assembly. And so, you know, you secure the collet to the roll pin, and then you wrap it out. And it takes a whole boatload of times to do it. You wrap it out, and then you can withdraw this housing. There's 2 O-rings that are on the housing, and if they're both bad, they're flattened, or maybe they got overheated, it's going to leak back here. Now, this is not something that's very common at all. Most of the time, you don't have to mess with this. Most of the time, I will replace this just as part of the, you know, the complete overhaul package. But if you're just looking to do a refresh, or if you're just simply buying this good used, you don't have to mess with this in most cases. So that's why you want to check and make sure it's not leaking. Okay, eyeball the selector shaft. Make sure the seal here is not leaking. And also make sure that these flats are in good shape. Sometimes these will be warped and you won't be able to get your little selector actuator arm, you know, with the little nipple. It won't correctly dock to it. Again, not super common. It's not something you have to stress about, but you just definitely want to eyeball this selector. And if there's like a nut on there, just take the nut off, make sure the threads are not boogered. Okay, basic common sense stuff. All right. The next area you want to look at, to the extent possible, is going to be the vent tube. So take a flashlight and shine it into the vent tube. Okay, there should not be any crud, any restrictions, any grime, no foreign objects in there, because if this is clogged, then what will happen is moisture that normally accumulates in the case, and it's true of all transmissions, moisture accumulates in the case as just part of natural condensation, and this tube is there specifically to allow that moisture to boil off and exhaust, if you will, to the outside air during operation. So when you shut the transmission, you shut the vehicle off and park it for the night, especially if you live in a cold weather environment, as the transmission cools, moisture will condense and it will actually begin to, you know, kind of form and I guess mix with the fluid. Now, the amount of moisture is so inconsequential, at least, you know, from drive cycle to drive cycle, that it's not like, you know, when you check the dipstick, it's going to be half water. But if this is plugged, that moisture will not be able to vent. It won't be allowed to exhaust from the case. So over time, moisture will build up in the case. What we call lubricity of the transmission fluid will begin to degrade and erode, and it will not be able to do its job, both as a friction enabler and a lubrication oil for your gear train, your shafts, and everything else, and they'll actually start to rust. And I've seen transmissions that have this problem where all the hard parts inside are covered with a layer of rust. And in some really bad cases, splines have stripped because they've just simply been eroded away by oxidation and rust inside the case because this was plugged. So always check for that. Make sure that, I mean, I know there's a bend here and it's impossible to truly see the entire length, but if there's going to be crud, chances are it's going to get caught up somewhere around in this bend and you'll be able to see it. All right, most of these transmissions, in fact, all of them are going to have the cooler line fitting, supply and return here in this location. It may or may not have a gasket present. You'll want to replace the gasket regardless of whether, you know, you're rebuilding it or you're going to buy it used. I would always replace this gasket. For your 2014 and up units, you're going to have that thermal bypass valve. So if that thermal bypass valve happens to be on the transmission, or in close proximity, maybe the transmission's still in the vehicle, then, you know, it's maybe a good idea to take it off, take it apart, and inspect it if you have the ability to do so, assuming you're in like a pick apart or pick and pull. Otherwise, you just want to check these two ports just to make sure that there's nothing clogged, there's no debris in there, any evidence that there was contaminant, like severe amounts of contaminant in the transmission system. Okay, the other thing you want to be mindful of too is transmissions that were in vehicles where the radiator internally began to leak coolant into the transmission internal cooler. All right, you get some radiators, they get a lot of miles on them, where again moisture is present above and beyond what the system was designed for, and it starts to rust and corrode, and it's usually at the internal joint where the transmission lines supply and return go into the internal transmission cooler that's inside your radiator. So look for signs of strawberry milkshake, especially around here. You might see them. If you do see that, then at the very least I would make an inquiry, but like strawberry milkshake is basically a disaster. Okay, when radiator fluid leaks inside the transmission, it destroys it. So I would just straight up avoid that particular unit. All right, let's come around to the front again, and we'll talk a little bit about the front pump. Okay, I'm gonna have to zoom in, get you close, but what you're gonna wanna do is take your flashlight and eyeball the inside of the pump here. Okay, now in this particular unit, the pump failed, and I'll get you closer so that you can see exactly what a failure looks like if you're shopping for one of these units. Now, these are what we call a rotor and slide design, or slide and rotor style pump. They use pump vanes, a slide and a rotor, just like a 4L60E, 700R4, or 204R, a bit scaled up for these units, but the principle is the same, and they are very vulnerable to both when the transmission is being taken out or put back in, due to the propensity of someone just mistakenly not catching the torque converter slipping off the front of the transmission a little bit and becoming disengaged from the lugs. And when the vehicle's fired up, the torque converter will destroy the pump rotor, will shear the lugs off. So you want to check that, because obviously you don't want to buy a transmission with the intention of installing it as is and finding out that the vehicle won't move because the pump has been destroyed. Okay, the other things you want to check for are stator splines. Okay, check your splines here, and then check your input shaft splines for wear. Okay, sometimes you'll see in real high horsepower applications, aftermarket modded engines and such, that the splines will be slightly twisted. Okay, I don't think I've ever seen a set of stator splines twisted, but I have seen a couple of input shafts where the end splines were twisted, and I've seen it in other transmissions too. I mean, it's not common, but you just want to check it. Okay, check this torque converter O-ring. Okay, one of the most, if not the most common pattern failure, motive failure with these transmissions actually doesn't happen inside the transmission itself. It's the torque converter. Okay, for any of you that are familiar at all with these units, you know the trials and tribulations of people have had by the gross when it comes to the JMBX converters. Okay, the reason that they are so bad is multifold and multifactorial, but one of the things that contributes to their high rate of failure is the design of the converter clutch itself. It is a woven style clutch that's roughly 22 or 25 thousandths of an inch thick, and and again, this is just my opinion, but that is a little bit undersized, if not a lot undersized, for these applications. Okay, all my 6L80s and 90s get at minimum a converter clutch with a 70 thousandths thick Borg-Warner high energy in place of the 20 or 25 thousandths thick woven style converter clutch. Clutch failure in the converter is also exacerbated by wear in the valve body, specifically the torque converter clutch regulator valve, wear in the pump, the converter control valve, and sometimes the TCC solenoid goes bad, and that contributes to wear and or failure as well. But needless to say, this little O-ring, if it's flattened here, that could be by itself a direct cause of converter clutch failure. When you have failure in the converter, there's at least a 50-50 chance that it has also damaged the pump in a way that the pump needs to be replaced or completely gone through, remachined and reconditioned. So let me get you a little bit closer so you can kind of see into here to the best of my ability, and you can get an idea and a sense of what a destroyed pump looks like. Alright, this may be the best I can do, unfortunately, but basically when you look in this cavity here, you're looking into the pump itself, specifically the pump body, and what you're looking for are two lugs, one on either side of the stator. They could be at any position, but there's going to be one here, say, and then the opposite side 180 degrees. If you do not see those two lugs, if it's just all the way around, there's nothing there, you see jagged edges or, chunks, then you know that the pump is no good, the rotor has been shattered, and you obviously don't want to buy this 6L80 or 90. The other thing too is scrutinize the seal. Okay, you can do like just a physical check, make sure it's supple. Okay, if the seal is not supple, if it's hardened or if it's cracked, that would indicate that the transmission had a leak at the converter, and more than likely it was losing fluid, and that could, that could imply that it is impaired elsewhere in the case due to fluid shortage or run low on fluid. The other thing to check for is the presence of the snap ring. If the snap ring is missing, I would want to know why. Of course, the person we're buying this from is not going to have any clue. Do these seals pop out? Not really, but you want to make sure the snap ring is present, because if it's not, that would mean somebody was monkeying with the transmission. And again, whenever somebody has a transmission, they have gone back with it, and stuff like that is missing, that should be a red flag for you. Alright, the presence of the inspection covers is not that important. I mean, you're going to have your own. It's nice to have, I guess, if they're there, but if not, it's not the end of the world. Alright, so we talked about the physical inspection of the bell housing, the pump, what to look for there. We talked about splines. Check this area in here too. That's going to be your converter feed. Again, make sure that this bore in the input shaft is not plugged, not clogged up with dirt, grit, or grime. That can happen if the transmission's been left out or been moved from yard to yard, and just crud got in there over time. So all things you want to kind of look out for. All right, so let's talk about swapping transmissions specifically to run them as is, because if you're going to just buy one of these and overhaul it, then what I'm about to talk about is not going to matter too much. But if you're buying a transmission used with the intention of installing it because you just simply don't have the funds at the moment to have the transmission overhauled or even do it yourself, I mean, these things are very, very, very expensive compared to the 4-speeds to properly go through, then there's something that you need to know if you don't already, and that has to do with the TECM and its relationship with your powertrain control module in your vehicle. Okay, now the TECMs are they're not VIN specific, meaning it's not like programs for your specific vehicle, but they are programmed for specific models and submodels of vehicle. So for example, the operating system on this Cadillac CTS-V's TECM is going to have a slightly different shift strategy in programming software version than, say, the same transmission out of a diesel application. So if you try and install one of these transmissions out of a radically different application, say you're trying to put this transmission into a truck, then you're going to have all kind of problems basically shifting. It's not going to shift right, it's not going to feel right, and you may or may not know what to do. So the reason I bring that up is because most folks are not going to have the ability to reprogram the TECM themselves. You can do it. You can purchase a subscription to AC Delco's technical delivery service, and you have to purchase a special cable to hook into your laptop so that you can interface with the PCM and TECM and use their software package to reprogram your TECM. Now, I'm making the assumption here that you're not going to want to do that for whatever reason. Now, if you do that, then what I'm saying here is really not applicable, because you can reprogram the TECM to suit your needs. So now you must be thinking, okay, well, I'm not going to pay money for a online subscription. I don't know anything about programming, powertrain control modules and TECMs and all that. I just need to, get my vehicle back on the road. I just want to install the transmission, fill it with fluid, run my Fast Adapt Relearn, and go. And I'll talk about the Fast Adapt Relearn in a second as well. But all right, so if you know how to do that, then what I'm saying doesn't apply. So what you're probably thinking is, okay, well, what are my options here, right? What are my options? So on forums, I've had reports of folks, because I've never done this myself, so I want to preface what I'm about to tell you by saying I've never ever done this myself personally, no need to, but I've had reports of folks on forums of what they were doing is taking the entire control body assembly, the TECM, the valve body assembly, the internal mode switch, and their wiring harness and speed sensor assembly from their bad transmission and swapping out the replacement's transmission control body complex with the one from theirs. Because these cases themselves and the hydraulic circuitry they're in and the hydraulic circuitry and the pump cover never actually changed. They're all the same throughout all years of production for 6L80 and 6L90. So what they were doing was swapping the entire complex from their bad transmission to the replacement, bolting it in, running a fast adapt relearn, and driving away with it without any issue whatsoever. So let me talk about the circumstances in which you can do that and the things you need to know and keep in mind if that's the direction you want to move in. Okay, so if you're going to take that approach, here is the single most important thing that you need to keep top of mind. All right, the single most important piece of information you need to know. In 2012, GM made a significant and material change to the output shaft ring gear assembly in these transmissions, 6L80, 6L90. Okay, they went from what is called a dual ring gear setup to a uni-gear setup. Okay, a dual ring gear setup is where you have two independent ring gears for each layer, each level of the Raveno style rear or output planetary assembly. Okay, let me see if I can find one here real quick and I can show you for reference so that you know what I'm talking about, because this context is important so you understand why I'm telling you what I'm going to tell you. Okay, so here we have a rear planetary carrier out of a 6L80E. I believe this is a 2011 core that I have all apart, and the dual ring gear setup. So let's get everything in the frame. So if you look at the Planet here, you'll have a bottom set of pinion gears here and a top set. Notice the bottom set's a little bit taller than the top set. Likewise, notice the bottom ring gear is a little bit taller than the top ring gear. And then you have your spacer. So these go on to the Planet. Okay, like so. And they both nest inside of the ring gear basket as part of the output shaft assembly. So in 2012, they went away from this kind of separate ring gear design where you have two separate ring gears for this Planet, and they went to what they call a uni-gear design. And I'll flash a picture on the screen so that you know what that looks like in relation to this. But why this is important is because this design change required a change to the design of the rear speed sensor or vehicle speed sensor or output speed sensor. Okay, there's two speed sensors in this control body complex. They're on the case facing side of the valve body assembly, and they're held in by two 10mm bolts. There's an input speed sensor, an output speed sensor, and then a wiring harness that connects them. Now, with this uni-gear design, they changed the output speed sensor, and it's different dimension-wise. I'm not, I don't want to say because I don't have one in front of me, but just take my word for it, it's different. And so if you install an early speed sensor designed to work with a separate ring gear design like this onto a transmission that has a uni-gear design, then you will have issues with the transmission being able to function correctly. And those issues can range from no upshifts whatsoever to extremely late harsh shifts, or pretty much everything in between. I mean, whatever you can imagine. The bottom line is this: you want to make sure that whatever your unit is, the replacement unit, if it's 2012 and later, you're going to need to swap your speed sensor assembly, harness speed sensor, onto the underside of that valve body complex if you have a 2006 to 2011 vehicle, because otherwise you're going to have problems. So again, make sure you do that if you're going to go that route. I mean, you don't have anything to lose. Either it's going to work or it's going to not work, but worst case scenario, you just may have to reorder a Tecum. But like I said, I've never done it because there's no reason for me to do it. However, folks on internet forums that I frequent have reported success in swapping the entire control body complex, Tecum, valve body, internal mode switch, and speed sensor harness assembly from their bad transmission onto a replacement good used transmission, and just simply running the Fast Adapt Relearn and having success, having the transmission work just like it should, just like they expect, with no issues. Alright, so that brings me to the Fast Adapt Relearn. What is that? Okay, I want to make sure that there is a distinction made, that that reprogramming and Fast Adapt Relearn are two entirely different things. They are not the same thing. Okay, if you don't know too much about these transmissions and you're just doing some initial fact finding, I see from time to time folks that are just trying to learn, they are under the impression that those two are one and the same. They'll use the terms interchangeably when they are in fact two completely different terms with different meanings. Reprogramming in this context means you are changing the operating system software version on your transmission. Okay, that's what reprogramming means in this context. Okay, Fast Adapt Relearn means that you are simply resetting the factory adapts to their default position. Okay, it's sometimes called pressure adapts. So with these 6 speeds, 8 speeds, and 10 speeds, and the equivalent front-wheel drive transaxles, computing, command and control has gotten extremely sophisticated compared to the legacy 4-speed stuff. And so these computers, these transmission control modules for all OEMs, makes and models, they're designed to adapt the transmission's command and control, line pressure, and shifting characteristics to your driving habits within the bounds of what the factory programs into the TCM. So, if you're an aggressive driver and you're constantly into the throttle, it'll adapt to that. If you're, drive it normally, it'll adapt to that. If it's a working truck or, used in another specialized application, then to an extent it'll adapt. And it'll make sure that the transmission control strategy and the application and release of the various applied elements and sets of clutch packs in these units is done in a way that matches the demand being put on it by the engine and, in a broader sense, the vehicle and the driver. So if you have a transmission problem, okay, the system will adapt to try and protect the transmission from further damage. An example of this will be a leaking 3/5R clutch drum, which is very, very common in all these transmissions. In a leaking 3/5R clutch drum, you may experience what we call flare shifting from second to third gear. You may experience a delayed engagement into reverse, or you may experience flare shifting and or slippage into third and fifth gear, respectively. And so when the TCM sees this, it will compensate by bumping the line pressure a little bit to mitigate the slipping, to try and bring more applied force to that clutch pack to keep it clamped so that it doesn't slip and further destroy itself. So obviously that's only going to work to a certain extent. The transmission can't infinitely adapt. It can also magically reline friction discs that have their clutch material worn away by just heat and slippage and as a result of pressure loss at that 3/5R drum base weld. So whenever you have that happen, and you overhaul the transmission, you re-weld the 3.5R drum, it goes back in, it's good to go, no leaks, and everything else is brand new in terms of soft parts, clutches, steels, and maybe even the Tecum and the other electronics. That PCM will still be storing all the adapts. So you have to reset those adapts so that it doesn't think that the transmission's still impaired. Because if you don't, at the very least, you're going to have very harsh and late shifts because it's still operating under the assumption that your third, fifth, and reverse clutch is damaged and needs additional help to try and keep it from getting even more damaged. So that's fast adapt, okay? So, in summary, programming is reprogramming the version of the operating system software loaded onto the Tecum, for your specific model, submodel here, vehicle, whereas fast adapt is simply resetting those adapts to factory default. Okay, now there's a third term you may be familiar with, that's called tune or tuning. In this context, tuning means you are changing the parameters in which the transmission functions. So there is software out there in which you can do that. For example, it's a noisy car. For example, HP Tuners is arguably the most popular. I mean, it's the most well-known. You have EFI Live, and then there's several other software applications that you can use to tune your transmission by changing the parameters in which it was programmed to operate within from the factory. An example of this would be torque converter clutch duty cycle and torque converter clutch apply strategy. You can tune the Tecum and PCM to eliminate torque converter clutch activity in gears 1 through 4 and only keep it active in gears 5 and 6. Okay, that's something that some folks will do. You can also increase the duty cycle, meaning the amount of pressure on that converter clutch to keep it clamped and avoid slippage. So those are just examples. Whether or not you want to do that with your vehicle is really going to be situational and individual use case dependent, but just to kind of illustrate the point, those are the three main terms that you should be familiar with when it comes to these transmissions: programming, fast adapt, relearn, and tuning. Okay, it's always good to marry a good quality overhaul with a performance tune. All other things equal, it'll make the transmission shift better, perform better, and at the same time promote more longevity. All right, so that's the story with the Tecum. If you do decide to replace your transmission with a good used one, of course you can opt to purchase a reman Tecum that is specifically set up for your vehicle. If you buy your Tecum from General Motors, or if you buy an entire remanufactured transmission from GM, you will not have to run a fast adapt relearn. They set the transmission up for you based on your VIN number, so that all the programming and all the adapts and everything else as it relates to the command and control of the transmission is already set up for you. All you have to do is stab it, fill it with fluid, following the correct and proper procedure, and go. That's it. There may be other manufacturers in the aftermarket out there that do that as well. I don't know. I couldn't tell you. I have to call and check. Street Smart Transmissions, Sonics, there's a few others that manufacture Tecums, or reman Tecums I should say, so you want to check and see if they also perform the fast adapt for you, resetting it to the default based on whatever it was from GM originally. Alright, a lot of talking about the Tecum. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. So if you do have access to the dipstick area, meaning this little thing is missing, although that's kind of a concern in and of itself if this is not there. Okay, you definitely want to shine your flashlight, and then you want to take your pencil magnet or a thin screwdriver or something, a rod or something, and dip it down in. Just kind of dip it down into the pan and see what comes out. Okay, you see a whole bunch of metal, kibbles and bits, chunks. a lot of shiny material on the end of that magnet, then you want to avoid the transmission, pass on it and look for one that doesn't have, that stuff on it from the magnet in the bottom of the pan. Otherwise, if the fluid looks good, it smells clean, it doesn't smell obviously burnt, then it may be a good unit. So again, we're making a lot of assumptions here based on these checks that they will bear fruit, and that the correlation between the results of your exterior visual and physical inspection are going to align with the transmission's actual condition. I'm not going to try and give you a number or percentage of the time that's the case, but the idea here is that you weed out some obviously bad candidates before you put money on the table. Okay, nothing's guaranteed, but you can mitigate the risk that you buy a bad unit by doing these checks. So the other thing, check along the underside. Make sure it has all of its pan bolts. I mean, you can see here all of the hole locations occupied. All right. And you want to make sure that these bolts are tight. If they're loose, then that's a sign the pan's been off recently. And if you do happen to shine your flashlight into the pan and you can see the bottom and it's like squeaky clean, but the rest of the transmission's filthy, that's another red flag for me, because somebody may have been trying to cover up, hide, or obfuscate an obvious severe problem with inside the transmission, such as damaged planetaries or completely smoked frictions, etc., etc. So a squeaky clean pan, an otherwise dirty unit, is cause for concern. I mean, it's possible the owner tried to do a service on it or did a service on it, but then again, like, why is he selling it? Why is he selling it if it's supposedly a good unit? Unless he's selling it as a core. Now, you want to ask, is this a good transmission or is this a rebuildable core? Like, what are you considering this to be? How are you selling it? Is it one or is it the other? And it's best to get that clarification from them on the phone. Alright, the 6L90s are a little bit longer physically than the 6L80s, so you want to make sure that you're buying the correct unit. You're not going to bring your 6L80 with you or 6L90 with you, to go and compare side by side. So the RPO code for the 6L80 is MYC, the RPO code for the 6L90 is MYD. So, that's just, I guess, some additional information you can use if you don't already have it, but they are longer by about 6 inches, I think. All right, I think I've talked long enough. If there's anything I missed, go ahead and put it in the comments. If there's any tips, tricks, or pointers that you think that would be helpful for others, please also place them in the comments. I'd be grateful, and I know others would too. Otherwise, I'm going to wrap the video here, and I thank you, as always, for watching. Appreciate all your viewership, and I'll continue to make videos on these transmissions, so if you haven't done so already, please subscribe. I do them fairly frequently, so always be on the lookout for new content as it relates to the 6L80s and 90s. I don't see the 45s or 50s all that much for whatever reason. I just, people don't bring them to me, so mostly 6L80 and 6L90. Alright, well, until the next time we meet, enjoy the rest of your day or evening, and thank you again.